Welcome to the, what, is it Wednesday night, Thursday night? Welcome to tonight for the Lectores reading series, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Jason Ockert, one of the faculty members teaching the program. Thanks for the big shout out there. And so I have the distinct pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Joe Oestreich, to the stage. He's going to be reading here in just a second. Like I said, he's my friend, and he and I teach back in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. But we do more than teach. We also play cards from time to time. We watch football, and sometimes we even golf. He's better than I am by quite a bit. He also likes to run, though we don't do this together since I only sprint when being chased. That's my motto, and I've been chased by some of you students, by the way. Don't think I don't know that. Joe's a big-hearted, easygoing Midwesterner who can wrangle any bit of small talk minutia you might throw at him into a meaningful conversation. He won't, in other words, blow off a bloviating stranger who happens to make an obtuse and obvious comment about the weather. Like, if you come up to him after all this and say, "Hey, it's normally not this cold in Tampa." A perfectly inane thing to say to someone who's not from here. It is hard, after all, to encounter another human you've not met. So you might say something weather-related. What's worth noting, though, is that my man Oestreich will come back at you with something unexpected. Likely, he knows about a cold front moving in from the Bay. Or, as his plane was migrating down from South Carolina, he saw from his window the telltale gathering of the clouds and knows what you mean. Yeah, it is cold for Tampa. And here's a plausible reason for why, he'll explain. One of the things I most admire about Joe is his curiosity. He spent his youth playing in a rock and roll band called Watershed. Actually, he's still in the band. The band came close, and I mean really close, to signing a monstrous record deal and becoming the next Cheap Trick. But then things fell apart, as things are wont to do, I suppose, in the rock and roll business, and he found his way into the MFA program at Ohio State University. The best thing that happened to Joe at OSU is that he met Erica Dawson. That was the best thing that could have happened to him. But the second best thing that happened is that he started to write his memoir, Hitless Wonder, My Life in Minor League Rock and Roll. The tag for the book reads this way: everyone knows the price of fame. Hitless Wonder measures the price of obscurity. What happens when you chase a dream into middle age and, in doing so, risk losing the people you love? Joe's not afraid to take risks. He's done so by staying with Watershed all these years, and he's done so in his writing. About Hitless Wonder, Publishers Weekly writes, "This insightful and entertaining story of a band that almost but didn't quite make it big in the 1990s is equal parts fascinating autobiography and a hilarious and savvy look at the harsh realities of the music industry." Kirkus Review lauds, "Oestreich has an eye for telling nuance, and his knowing recounting of life is an ascendant band, and the, quote, prose is juicy stuff." Juicy stuff. It's more than that, of course. Reviews don't plumb the depths. Life after the memoir found Joe in South Carolina, learning a little about the ebb and flow of the South. That curiosity that I mentioned earlier, along with his love of football, led him to an incident that occurred in Conway back in 1989. That year, the Conway High School football coach decided that he was going to bench his star quarterback, who was African American, and instead play a different kid who was white, who also happened to be the son of one of the coaches. This single decision set off a series of events which affected the region and, in fact, the country. In order to learn about this new world that Joe moved into, he and another colleague decided to embed themselves in the present-day rival football's team. Joe followed the season in the locker room, on the bus, along the sidelines for Conway High School, while his colleague infused himself into Myrtle Beach High School team. After fully immersing himself into the football culture now, Joe was able to investigate the racial tensions and inequalities of the past. The result of his work is his second book, Lines of Scrimmage, a story of football, race, and redemption, from which he'll read in a second. We live in a vast and perplexing world. We've learned this from the gifted writers who have shared their work with us at these Lectores readings. There's a lot to take in. What I've taken away from these last few days is this. While it's tempting to relinquish the life jacket and float, to be a speck upon the turbulent sea, the people I admire most lash pieces of driftwood together and build a boat. They find a place to stand, whether they belong there or not. Joe is one of the most hardworking people I know. He's crazy disciplined with his writing schedule, and he's one of the most generous and thoughtful instructors that I've ever met. He reminds me that I can do better. Instead of being capsized by the bigness of the world, he's invigorated by it. He runs upon the shore and names the waves. It's an honor to share him with you tonight, so please join me in welcoming Joe Oestreich.
Thanks, Jason. That was publishable. Thanks to Erica, of course, for having me, and Alan, and Jeff, and Lynn, and everybody down here in Tampa. You know, it's a little cold for this time of year. I'm going to read a little bit from both of the books that Jason mentioned here, and it occurs to me during one of these conversations that happened a little earlier, talking about Florida, talking about Tampa, it dawned on me that the last time I was in Florida was about 13 years ago when my band, Watershed, played at the House of Blues in Orlando, opening up for the Insane Clown Posse. Juggalos in the house. On that night, like every night we opened up for them, which we did for about 2 months straight, skinny-tied, sort of wide-faced Midwesterners from Columbus opening up for psychopathic killer clowns. What happened that night is we got stuff thrown at us. Jolly Ranchers, quarters, nothing cool like underwear, more like socks, you know? So look, as long as we keep this stage sock-free tonight, everything's gonna be good. Trust me, I'm a professional. So I'm going to read a little bit, a few pages from Hitless Wonder, which was the first book, the book about Watershed. I'm getting old, so I'm going to put my cheaters on here. That's cool, right? All right, so this is a little bit from the second chapter, and because we're joining the action part of the way through, all you need to know is if I talk about a character, a female character named Betty. She's the bartender at this bar, and I call her Betty because she looks like Betty Page with the bangs and the pigtails. Any other names you hear, I'm talking about the guys in the band. The name Kate, that will be my wife. This is the first night of the tour in this book. We joined Watershed in Detroit, Michigan. We have just played for 5 people. That's what you need to know. Okay. Thank you. Good night. I take off my bass and raise it high in the air, as I've seen so many MTV caliber rock stars do. I stand there, proud as a torchbearer, sweating like a sparring partner, holding my guitar by the neck, headstock nearly touching the lights, and I want so badly for the crowd to chant our name, to cheer for one more song, to stomp their feet and slam their seats and not let us go anywhere. I want them to want me. I'm begging them to beg me. But this is the minor leagues, buddy. So here's what we get. We get golf applause. We get a yeah or two. We get 5 minutes to get our shit off the stage. What do you do for an encore when there is no encore? I head to the merch table, where some kid with multiple piercings walks up and says, "You guys rocked. Where are you from?" And he looks over our CDs and asks what album that last song was on, but he doesn't buy because $10 is $10 and beer ain't cheap. Then he pulls a CD from his coat pocket, hands it to me and says, "If you ever want to trade gigs with us, man, look me up." I don't want to open for this guy's band. I don't want his band to open up for us. But for some reason, I feel guilty about taking his CD, so I swap him one of ours quid pro quo, even though we can't afford an even swap because our record company charges us $5 per disc. Now, thanks to a trade I didn't ask for or want, we're down 5. We'll have to sell another CD to get back to 0. But nobody else is showing the slightest interest. They're grabbing their coats and purses and filing toward the door. I beat it to the bar. And no, beer isn't cheap. I drank through my drink tokens by mid-set, so now I have to crack my own wallet. And this gets me thinking there ought to be a law. Some equity in the workplace statute that mandates unlimited beer for bands. Free draft at least, and food too, at 50% off minimum, because it suddenly occurs to me that the last thing I ate was a truck stop banana and a granola bar, and that was about 10 hours ago. Since then, I've had 2 cups of coffee and 6 beers. I asked Betty, the bartender, if anybody's serving this late, and she tells me about a diner that cooks up a furiously good omelet. It's just 10 miles down the expressway. Take the second exit, or is it the third? No, the second. Then go through 2 lights, make a left, and another left, and it's right there. You can't miss it. But we can miss it. We will miss it. And I don't want to drag everybody on a wild omelet chase anyway. They'd all be asleep by the time we reach this house of furious eggs. So I ask Betty, whose cleavage, I'm just now noticing, is dotted with freckles, "How about Taco Bell?" She pulls a ballpoint from her back pocket, and I force myself to maintain eye contact as her wife beater slides up her belly, revealing 3 inches of milky skin and a string of panty elastic. Scratching directions on a napkin, I think, this is rock and roll, right? Instead of charting a course to a cheese chalupa, shouldn't I be drawing a map back to her apartment? Shouldn't she be sliding me 4 quarters to drop into the ladies' room condom machine? Isn't rock equals sex a universal law on par with Newtonian physics? Never mind that I'm married and I'd never cheat on Kate. Even if I weren't wearing a ring, the odds of me betting the bartender or anyone else tonight are roughly as long as me launching our van to the moon. 1, the crowd is light. From a sheer numbers perspective, if there are only 2 or 3 women in the bar, how many of them are realistically looking for casual sex with an obscure musician from out of town? Casual sex with a rock star? Maybe. But it's tough to make a case for your rock stardom when you've just played for fewer people than are at this moment idling in the Taco Bell drive-thru. 2, say there exists in the world a woman who fantasizes about hooking up with little-known bass players. Say she's in the bar tonight. Even say she walks up, grabs me by the shoulders, and says, "Fuck me, you 4-stringed beast." Where would we do it? Her place? Okay. But how would I get there? Chances are she doesn't sleep in a cot above the bar. She probably lives across town in the suburbs. And even if she's sober enough to drive me to her pad, forgetting for a moment that sober women rarely shake you by the shoulders till you fuck them, and even if she doesn't have a boyfriend/roommate/parent that might nix the deal, and even if we could manage to wrangle a condom and do the deed before either of us passed out, then still, how do I get back to the van before the band takes off for tomorrow's show in Milwaukee? Straying too far from the herd, making the band drive hell's half-acre in search of your horny ass is a surefire way to get them all strangling mad. Bands break up at those velocities. So why not do it in the van? After all, there's a whole bumper sticker genre dedicated to that very act. If the van's rockin', then don't come knockin', etc. Thing is, the van is the sun around which a band's galaxy rotates. So except for the 45 minutes we're on stage, someone's always holed up there. Dave calling his wife, Pooch swigging a beer, Colin tuned in to the last inning of the ball game. Now, assuming I could carve out 10 minutes when the van is empty, and assuming this bass fetishist and I could pull off the gymnastics required to get our pants down and our pelvises close enough to physically do it without hitting our heads on the ceiling or falling off the bench seat and onto the floor, then we'd still have to compensate for the frigid weather, the various and sundry smells, sweat, smoke, flatulence, last night's Taco Bell, the backpacks, duffel bags, and wet clothes heaped on the seats, and finally the used water jugs and beer cans and Gatorade bottles scattered everywhere, some of which now contain tobacco spit or urine. Overcome these disincentives, and I'd bump up against a single hard truth. A woman who consents to sex in a van littered with spittle and piss is not a woman you should have sex with. What about the hotel? Sometimes there isn't one. So the plan is to drive through the night to the next gig in the next town where we have booked a room. And when we get there at 9 or 10 in the morning, we'll try to convince the desk clerk to let us check in early. If he doesn't, then the unshowered, unshaven band will raid the continental breakfast and snooze in the lobby, drawing suspicious looks from the well-scrubbed business types until the clerk finds us a clean room. Then we'll sleep the 8 hours until sound check, and we'll sleep again after the show, giving us 2 nights for the price of 1. As thrifty as this strategy is, it doesn't ease the logistics of romantic liaisons. Tonight happens to be a night when we do have a room in town, but it's just that, a room, 1, for 6 people. 4 on the beds, 2 on the floor. Betty would make 7. Now, true, a lack of comfort and privacy has never stopped anyone who really wants sex from forging ahead. But any woman who'd fuck me on a hotel carpet next to 5 snoring guys, well, this would be much more an indictment of me than her. On this night when there is no encore, when nobody seems to care if we play another song or not, I can fantasize about pursuing the Apollo-sized project that is getting laid. But I won't do it, because I am married, because I'd never cheat on Kate, because I'm probably just a few years younger than Betty's mom. Besides, I've played in a band long enough to know that after-show sex really only exists for MTV-caliber rock stars. And even for them, it has pretty much dried up. Rock music is old. Music played by dads for dads. The official soundtrack of Viagra. But there's one further obstacle keeping my hands on the safe side of Betty's panties. It's stacked near the back door. And unlike some mythical, bass-loving, spit and pee-tolerant sex pot, it's not going to load itself into the van. Here in rock and roll's trenches, the show might be over, but the work isn't done. So I fold the Taco Bell directions into my back pocket and hand Betty her pen. I smile and say thanks. See you next time. I move down the bar to where the guy who gave me his CD is finishing his beer, and I say, thanks again, dude. Can't wait to check out the disc. Then I put on my coat, slide on my gloves, and walk toward the 700 pounds of speaker cabinets, amplifiers, and drum hardware that are always waiting to be humped. So I'm going to read now a little bit. Watershed's kind of always the opening act, right, for the Insane Clown Posse and Cheap Trick and Ben Folds and a lot of other bands. So I'm going to open with Watershed. Now I'm going to close with a little bit from the newest book here, Lines of Scrimmage. So as Jason said, This is about an incident that happened in Conway, South Carolina in 1989, when 31 of the 37 African-American players on the football team walked away from the squad in an act of protest against what they felt was a racist decision by the coach when he benched a black quarterback in favor of a white quarterback. So the book opens up at the funeral of the spokesman for the striking players. So it opens up not in 1989, but in the present day. And I'm going to read a little bit from that. The Black Baptist minister walks across the stage in the Conway High School auditorium. A tall man wearing a dark suit, he approaches the lectern and spreads his arms to give himself the appropriate physical presence needed to begin his portion of the afternoon's proceedings. He adjusts the microphone and then clutches the podium with both hands, his torso bent at an angle that would make a chiropractor wince. This is the practiced tilt that gets him physically and spiritually closer to his audience every Sunday. But on this day, it also allows him to steal a look down to the foot of the stage, at the casket containing Reverend Henry Singleton II, civil rights leader, public school teacher, and this man's mentor and friend. Jerry Falk is the minister's name, and at first his remarks come slowly and at a relatively low volume, given the size of the auditorium and the hundreds of mourners seated within it. He speaks with the inflection and intonation the crowd expects from a Southern preacher, including the well-measured pauses not just between but within sentences, pauses that give his audience just enough space to slip in an "uh-huh" or a "tell it." He's telling the story of his ordination ceremony, of the day he was called to preach the word not only by God, but by the men who served on the Area Baptist Association Council. He was drawn to the church most especially by one man on that council, the Reverend H.H. Singleton, the man who, as this fledgling preacher was giving his initial sermon, pointed his long finger at the nervous minister and said, "That's Ace's, boy," and "Preach it, boy," and then afterward, "Job well done." The Reverend Singleton taught him to fight the good fight as an advocate for humanity, tell it. Challenged him to be a good soldier and a servant of God, that's right. And reminded him that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Come on. Singleton led him on marches through the oak-lined streets of this coastal South Carolina town, through thunder and lightning and a hard rain of hatred and bigotry, and through all those challenging times, the minister walked behind Singleton, asking himself and those around him, "What manner of man is this?" He's interrupted with applause. "What manner of man is this?" he shouts a second time. And as the acclamation rises in pitch and intensity, he strides back to his seat. As powerful as this ending flourish is, the line that still resonates, even as the next speaker prepares to take the podium, is not "What manner of man is this?" but instead a line that the minister repeated near the beginning of his remarks. At that moment, just when a more reserved clergyman might have offered a platitude along the lines of, "Reverend Singleton has found his reward now, may he rest in peace," this minister raised one hand and yelled, "Fired up! Ready to go!" The pauses between and after these two phrases prepared the crowd to join him in a call and return chant. Fired up, ready to go, ready to go. His cadence brought to mind a drill sergeant's marching call. Fired up, 1, 2, ready to go, 3, 4. With the second and third repetitions, the crowd was answering back in full voice, and about half of the assembled bolted to their feet. Middle-aged men in suits and ties, Sunday-dressed women wearing hats as ornate as wedding cakes, a few young guys in cornrows and sunglasses. Fired up, ready to go. It's likely that most Americans, were they to witness this scene in this high school auditorium in Conway, South Carolina, on this January Saturday, 16 days before the nation's first black president is to be sworn in for a second term, would hear "Fired Up, Ready to Go" and assume it was a reference to Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. But for this crowd, "Fired Up, Ready to Go" has a much longer history, one that stretches at least as far back as 1989. And when blacks in Conway say 1989, everybody around here knows what it means. It means the 1989 Conway High School football boycott, when 31 of the team's 37 black players, for whom the Reverend H.H. Singleton was a spokesman, walked away from the squad as a demonstration against Coach Chuck Jordan's decision to start an inexperienced white kid at quarterback over an experienced black kid. A move that many of the players and community members perceived as racist. Soon, the Conway football boycott became the Conway movement, transcending high school sports and growing into a protest against societal injustice, socioeconomic inequality, and the kind of institutional prejudice that many of Conway's white citizens had long assumed was over and done, had it ever existed in the first place. "Fired Up, Ready to Go" is a nifty campaign slogan, but the militaristic rhythm of the chant, "Fired up, 1, 2, ready to go, 3, 4, is made for marching. And in 1989, with H.H. Singleton leading the way, marching is just what Conway's black population did. In conjunction with the state and national offices of the NAACP, Singleton organized marches through Conway and neighboring Myrtle Beach, including several down Church Street, Conway's main drag, the road the high school sat on then as it does now. One stormy Saturday, Singleton walked arm in arm with fellow civil rights leaders, undaunted by lightning and rain or by the members of Conway's white population who stood at the curb throwing middle fingers. With many of the folks who are in attendance today, plus over 1,000 more following behind him, Singleton called out, "Fired up, ready to go." When Barack Obama tells the story of his adoption of the "Fired Up, Ready to Go" slogan, he mentions that he first heard it at a campaign stop in Greenwood, South Carolina, when a supporter named Edith S. Childs began chanting it from within the crowd. Today at Conway High School, the Reverend Dr. Nelson Rivers III, a vice president in the national NAACP office, reminds the assembled that yes, Barack Obama borrowed the chant from Edith S. Childs. But Edith S. Childs, he says, borrowed it from the Conway movement. And the lion of that movement was Reverend H.H. Singleton. In 1989, "Fired Up, Ready to Go" echoed through town in marches, meetings, and picket lines. Today, it evokes the moment when many blacks in Conway decided they'd been silent and compliant for too long. They chant to remember a time when they challenged the white establishment and stood up for justice, a time when the national media took notice and spread word of the Conway movement across America. Even though 23 years have come and gone since the football boycott that sparked the movement, and even though H.H. Singleton has passed away at the age of 80 and is no longer here to chant with them, and even though a black man is 2 weeks from starting his second term in the Oval Office, everybody's still fired up. They're still ready to go. The chant seems to carry past the back row of the auditorium, through the double doors and out into the hallways, where it rattles the master locks against the lockers. And I'll stop there and make way for Stefan. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome. By way of introducing Stefan Kiesbye tonight, I would like to tell you a little story. Oh, I'm Alan Michael Parker. Hi. It's actually really more of a confession and maybe even an apology, but I'm going to lie and call it a story. It ends well with a reading by Stefan. Last summer, I had the good fortune to spend a month in Europe on the island of Malta. I tell you this because I think that being a writer means accepting your inner freak, which I promise you Stefan has done, having now hung out with him a couple of years, and also that there are few freakier experiences than living on your own in Valletta, Malta during feast season and drinking warm Kiesbye beer at dawn on a Sunday while sprawled on a 17th century cannon that still fires, along with 7 St. Agatha's Parish hooligans. Probably that's another story that's a real story, and I'll save it for when I introduce Karina Valianatos next time. Anyway, writing and rewriting in my shoebox apartment in Malta's 100-and-a-million-degree weather, and desperate to be entertained when not writing and rewriting, I quickly read my way through the island's used bookstore, a collection of mostly god-awful titles, an ungoodly 3,000 of which were Maltese guidebooks in Maltese about what to see in Malta. Malta is an island, and Maltese is a dying language spoken on an island. Whom do you imagine comes to Malta to read a guidebook in Maltese? Notwithstanding, I'm sure that some of you had similar experiences trying to find books to read at the beach, say, or at a bus stop, or during your long stretches in prison. Of course, I had read Stefan Kiesbye's Your House is on Fire, Your Children All Gone, and I had it with me because it's a great book, and I think you should read it. But here's my confession. I was out of books, and so I went to the used bookstore, and I traded in Stefan's. But it's okay, it wasn't signed. Now, in the middle of negotiations over Stefan's book with the bookstore's spectacularly insane owner, he took out his glass eye and put it on the counter. He put his palm atop his eye, and then he began to roll his eye around. This is really why I want to tell this story. It's such a Stefan Kiesbye story. The guy rolled his eye at me. And to mention that as soon as the guy with the one eye read the jacket copy of Stefan's novel, and while he was rolling his other eye at me, he offered in exchange for this book the second and third Stieg Larsson thrillers, a copy of H.D.'s collected poems, Franklin Foer's How Soccer Explains the World, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night. By my math, that was 4.5 books to 1. I'm sorry, Stefan, I admit it. I took the deal. So now your novel's in a bookstore on the island of Malta, surrounded by Maltese guidebooks in Maltese, protected by a band of friendly sleeping hooligans, and watched over by a glass eye. The novels of Stefan Kiesbye have no expiration date. They belong in the used bookstore of the universe, where they're always being read and reread. They're books that operate within a genre that I am now calling high creepy. They locate us in our nightmares, explore the id-charged consequences of individual desire within the confines of socially constructed worlds. Rewind. I'm going to go back to the previous paragraph, but I should tell you that once I gave a reading in a grad program, there were about 100 writers in the audience, and in a moment of just total idiocy, I head-butted the microphone and broke it. That's true. The novels of Stefan Kiesbye have no expiration date. They belong in the used bookstore of the universe, where they're always being read and reread and traded. They're books that operate within a genre that I now call high creepy. They locate us in our nightmares, explore the id-charged consequences of individual desire within the confines of socially constructed worlds. They discharge our assumptions, and they consecrate our suspicions. They out-Poe Poe. They un-Hawthorne Hawthorne. His fifth book, a novella entitled The Staked Plains, does all this and more. The Staked Plains features Jenny, a part-time psychic who reads the future in her client's bare feet. The novella's set in the Llano Estacado, an approximately 37,514 square mile desert straddling New Mexico and Texas, where there is no water and there are no trees, but there is the occasional camel, along with the propensity to experience mirage, all of which is according to, and I love the internet, Dr. James B. Calvert, Associate Professor Emeritus of Engineering, University of Denver, who is, of course, a registered professional engineer in the state of Colorado, and whose license number is 12317. In this barren setting in this desert, Stefan's sentences shine. It's a novella in which a front lawn is turned into a beach by a drought and then measured in units of snakes. It was a lawn, as Stefan writes, quote, 7 snakes wide, end quote. High, creepy. Born on the coast of the Baltic Sea, Stefan Kiesbye studied drama and worked in radio before starting a degree in American Studies, English, and Comparative Lit at Berlin's Free University. A scholarship brought him to Buffalo, New York in 1996, and he went on to receive an MFA from the University of Michigan. His stories, poems, and essays have appeared widely in magazines and anthologies, and his books have won prizes, including the Low Fidelity Press Novella Award. His books have been a top 10 pick of Oprah magazine, she's famous, and made Entertainment Weekly's must list, that have been translated into German, Dutch, Japanese, Spanish, and written in English. He teaches at Sonoma State University, and here, Stefan.
She was a bad psychic when she arrived in Corrosa, New Mexico. Not because she didn't possess the powers, but she couldn't control them. Her husband moved them to the small town to teach at the college, and she didn't have anything to persuade him not to. "We'll make it fun," he promised. And after 30 days on the high plains, the great drought began. People seemed friendly. Her hair was strawberry blonde. She might have been Irish, but wasn't. And there were rumors spread carefully throughout her family's history that her great-great-great-grandmother had been a witch from the Black Forest who'd barely escaped Germany to the New World. Jenny was rather fond of that cobweb tale mended by each generation of women. They kept it intact, even though their last names changed and tore the women apart. Grandma Fulmer, the witch, was called, and Jenny had been born at Kestendorf and quite gladly switched to Preston. Sometimes, when she got up early enough to catch the pre-90-degree heat, she put on old running shoes, leashed her dogs, and ran with them past her street into the fields, past the Baptist Children's Home, past some dilapidated trailers that housed families and unchained dogs who followed her with threatening barks. Her dogs, Xerxes and Shibuya, strained and bared their teeth. Xerxes, the 12-year-old husky, growled, but Shibuya got up on 2 legs, begging to be let off her leash. After the first such episodes, Jenny packed graham crackers and threw them at the trailer dogs, and they left her alone. After another 2 miles, a set of abandoned trailers appeared on her right. The wind had carried off any truck or car tracks. The windows were broken. The roofs had been partly peeled off. The trash had stuck around, though, clinging to every bush and tree. Plastic bags, a child's tricycle, a carcass that might have been a cat or a dog. Jenny stopped to catch her breath, taking in the meanness of the place, and yet she couldn't bring herself to hate it. She named it Yucca Lowe's because everything around here was called Yucca something or other. Plumbers, phone and car companies. She lived in the neighborhood of Yucca Heights, a silly name since the Heights were just a few feet above the town's general 4,000-foot level, just above flood level, though no one remembered the last flood brought on by torrential rains. The abandoned trailers were the Lowe's. That they were allowed to exist soothed Jenny, like the common sight of people with 3 or 4 remaining teeth. She didn't owe anyone anything in this place. Xerxes and Shibuya stood watching the trailers, whose parts were moving in the wind. Shibuya's ears twitched, and she took tiny steps here and there. She was a greyhound mix and easily intimidated. Xerxes stared stoically at one trailer whose siding had been mostly stripped. She first saw him one morning scaling the cinder block wall and leaving their yard. The dogs made no noise, but 2 followed the apparition with mild curiosity, their noses dulled from cow dung and ethanol. Not even Diesel got up to bark. When she looked toward the chain link gate, a small body flew by, and the only thing she could make out was a faded Superman t-shirt. He was skinny. That much was immediately apparent, even though she only saw half of him the next time, an early morning, 10 days later, when nausea and itching had awakened her and she let out the dogs early. It was 4:30, and the sky only just turning lighter, and the yard light came on, and he peered out from the doghouse Carl had built to give Shibuya a hiding place when Diesel got too rambunctious. Jenny opened the screen door, and he took off, just like the first time. He wore stained shorts, and the same Superman t-shirt. He couldn't be much older than 6 or 7. He took the chicken, the ham. The bread he seemed to dislike. He didn't look cute when he ate, not like her dogs. His breath was as foul as theirs. He still wore his Superman shirt, his dirty sneakers. She kept boxes of lunch meat for the dogs, treats to lure them inside, to lure them into the garage and into their crate. They couldn't resist. She loved them for that weakness. Dog boy couldn't resist either. He had small teeth. Brown they were. His arms were full of scabs.